Hey everybody, I'm Jonathan Harvey. Welcome to the Weekly Take, where we look at Canada's biggest political stories of the week, what's happening, why it matters, and how it actually affects you. All right. On today's show, we will be talking about the Carney and Danielle Smith pipeline deal, which triggered Steven Guilbeault's resignation. The federal government says they are finally ready to roll out the gun buyback program across the nation. Canada moves away from feminist foreign policy while continuing to fund $1.73 billion in gender-focused foreign aid. The provincial and federal government face class action lawsuits over the Kawichan land ruling and the threat to private property rights. More than 23,000 patients in Canada died last year while on healthcare wait lists. And Canada's NGO class thinks it should choose your son's role models. All right, let's get into it. Our first story of the day. Carney and Danielle Smith signed a new pipeline deal sparking BC backlash, Indigenous opposition, and Guilbeault's resignation. Prime Minister Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith have signed a sweeping memorandum of understanding aimed at boosting Alberta's energy sector and pushing the province towards net zero by 2050 without any interim targets. Central to the deal is a private sector oil pipeline from Alberta to BC's Pacific Coast, co-owned with Indigenous partners and linked to the Pathways Alliance's carbon capture project. Under the agreement, Alberta will incentivize data centers, develop nuclear power, and ensure BC benefits financially, while Ottawa will scrap the oil and gas emissions cap, suspend clean electricity rules, streamline pipeline approvals, raise the industrial carbon price, and reduce methane emissions. The pipeline application is expected by July with the goal of maximizing jobs, exports, and tax revenues. Supporters see this as an economic win and potential pressure valve for Alberta's separatist movement. Critics, however, question its feasibility. BC officials dismissed the plan due to a lack of route, market, or support, which makes no sense. Indigenous communities oppose it, and past pipeline initiatives tied to climate policy have faltered. The deal has already prompted high-profile political fallout, including MP Steven Guilbeault's resignation from multiple cabinet posts, highlighting internal Liberal tensions. Whether the pipeline and broader deal actually happens remains uncertain, with political, legal, and logistical obstacles looming. So, the first thing to really consider here is that this is a memorandum of understanding. So, it may not actually come to life. There is a lot of opposition from BC. Now, that's primarily rather because you have an NDP government. They're very pro-socialist, pro-green, right? So they're not thinking about the economy. They're also not thinking about what might be better for Canada. They're really kind of towing their party line on maintaining their narrative, which you should come to expect. It just is what it is. You have Indigenous resistance, which seems common, but if I'm being perfectly honest, a lot of those things, a lot of Indigenous resistance is moved with economic force, if you know what I'm saying. So I wouldn't think that would be a huge hurdle. And obviously, there's some private sector uncertainty. So if this does come to life, though, here's one thing I would tell everybody to look out for. Carney will probably try to convince more foreign capital, more foreign investors, rather, to jump in and cover the cost of these things. This is what he's been doing under the FIPA, the FIPA agreement. Now, under this agreement, he's actually giving more power to foreign investors than Canadians get. And it's actually more legal coverage as well. So he's been using this to sort of push through a lot of the major projects as well. The UAE just invested $70 billion in Canada the other day. And a lot of people go, hey, this is such a great deal. Not really. It creates some short-term jobs, but the reality is you're giving the UAE control over our major assets. You know, they've invested in our critical minerals, oil, supply chains, pipelines, things like this. So you may see something similar here, and this is how Carney would likely get the investment and create a create like a wider moat for the investors to stop maybe the Liberals or the NDP or people in Canada from bringing this pipeline to life. So just something to look for. One of the positives, though, I do think is this will nuke the whole separatism talk. As I kind of mentioned in the summary, Alberta's too crucial for Canada. So if I'm thinking of patriotically, if I'm thinking about true patriot love, if I'm thinking patriotically about our country, Alberta is a key component. I believe they are responsible for between 17 and 20% of our GDP, primarily through energy. So it's crucial that we maintain unity with Alberta for Canada to continue down a strong path in the future. I know it's not great right now, but we have to assume things are going to improve. Alberta's a key component here. So by putting this on the table, I think this eliminates a lot of the separatist talk. Now, sure, there's going to be some sort of more extreme people that will continue with the narrative, but the reality is this takes the meat and potatoes off the table here. I don't think it comes to fruition now that they're talking about an oil pipeline. That is a deal tied together with the federal government and, of course, with BC. The other positive thing here, and it may take a little while for this to really come to light, or come to fruition rather, is you're starting to see the end of the green agenda as the overarching umbrella of the Liberal Party, right? Now, again, it's an MOU. So this may not play out the way we all want, well, the way I want it anyway, the way Canada should want it. But the reality is you've seen Guilbeault now step down from these cabinet positions. That means that this move was enough to ruffle feathers and sort of break free from that ideology. Now, do I think it'll be a clean break and now all of a sudden we're going to prioritize economics and energy? No, but I think it's a really, really good first step in that direction. And it was obviously a significant move, or significant enough of a move to get someone like Guilbeault to step down and move on, because it ruffled his feathers and it really goes against what he stands for. So while this may not turn out exactly the way we want, seeing a departure from the green agenda in this fashion and how it's created an internal conflict with the party is actually a positive. Because if Canada is going to correct course over the next 10, 20 years, whatever that looks like, and our economy is going to recover, we have to leverage our natural resources. And to do so, we need a Liberal leader to start backing away from this green agenda, which is exactly what we're seeing. All right, moving on. Story number 2 for the day. The federal government says they are finally ready to roll out the gun buyback program across Canada. The Liberal government's long-promised gun buyback program is supposedly rolling out across the country, but after years of delays, pilot projects, and repeated amnesties, Ottawa's promises are sort of hard to take seriously. Public Safety Minister Gary Anandasangri says the program will expand after a Nova Scotia pilot program aimed to collect just 200 assault-style firearms. However, participation numbers remain undisclosed, which is a weird thing to do if it went according to plan. This is the third extension of the original amnesty, which was first set to expire in 2022. So far, the scheme has handed out $22 million in compensation for over 12,000 firearms from businesses alone. Yet provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan fully oppose it, and the Ontario Provincial Police refuse to enforce it. Critics note Ottawa continues to target law-abiding gun owners while ignoring the smuggled firearms that drive crime. Even the minister admits doubt about the program's effectiveness and police capacity to enforce it, though Prime Minister Mark Carney maintains confidence in his minister. With $742 million budgeted and millions more lost to bureaucratic delays over efficient implementation, Canadians must ask, after years of pilots, extensions, and foot-dragging, will this program ever work, or should it exist at all? So, I mean, here's the issue. The gun buyback program is fundamentally flawed in a lot of ways. First of all, we know that it's targeting the wrong people. Over 50% of all gun crimes in Canada are done with handguns, not assault-style rifles, and the significant majority of those are smuggled in from America. So we're not really solving the problem by taking these away. And if you think about it, anybody that is a criminal is not going to participate in the program anyway. So even people that do have assault-style rifles, if they plan to use them for nefarious reasons, they're not going to give their guns up anyway. So this really only targets law-abiding citizens, which we'll get into a second why that's just a really terrible idea. The other reason is this is just a massive taxpayer waste. We're looking at $742 million right now. Originally, this was like a $200 million program, which was already sort of ridiculous. And if I'm being honest, I can't see this landing under $1 billion. Now, the societal consequences of stripping citizens' ability to defend themselves is really the problem here, right? You have disempowered citizens. And really what happens here is the criminals gain a significant advantage when law-abiding gun owners are left vulnerable. You know, you have illegal actors that now go, not only do I have a gun and you don't, I know that you're giving yours up. If this program actually plays out effectively, you're just going to have emboldened criminals, right? You're going to have rising dependence on the state. Now, we already know that citizens have to rely on police for a lot of things, and I can certainly appreciate the work that they do. But if someone's robbing your home and now you can't defend yourself because you had to give up your gun, I mean, this is a really big problem. It's another reason why I'm a big believer in castle laws, which we don't have here in Canada. I believe if someone breaks into your home, you should have the right to defend yourself. And I think it's preposterous for anybody to say, well, you should really think things through in the moment and use, an equivalent amount of force that they would use. Well, first of all, I don't know what kind of force they're going to use. I have a wife and a kid. I know that I have one job: execute. That's it. You deal with it later. And so for me, you take guns away from law-abiding citizens, it makes it a lot harder for them to defend themselves. And a whole other thing is we really should have castle laws. It's kind of preposterous that we don't. There's also sort of the continued erosion of freedom. When citizens can't defend themselves, it removes a critical check on state overreach. And look, I know people look at this and go, look, it's not the 1800s, Jonathan. You don't need weapons to fight the government. It's about having the capacity to do so. That's really what this comes down to. We see a lot of egregious policy that passes through our government. And they're doing it with impunity because we've got no way to really push back. And this is one of your last lines of defense. They start taking all your guns away. It's not just a legitimate, it's also sort of like I'm not sure if metaphorical is the right word, but it sort of is. You feel defenseless. You feel defenseless. There's something there when you're like, hey, at least I have a gun and I can defend myself and my family. Like, you have power over your own domain. And by taking that away, I think it just creates a culture of vulnerability and fear. And to be honest with you, I'm willing to bet that crime goes up. Guaranteed that. Like, bookmark this. 5 years from now, this program gets implemented. I'm telling you, crime goes up. It emboldens criminals. It gives them more free reign, and it stops us from being able to defend ourselves, and they know it. So I'm on team scrap the gun buyback and implement castle laws. All right, moving on. Canada moves away from feminist foreign policy while $1.73 billion in gender-focused foreign aid continues. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced Canada will no longer pursue an explicit feminist foreign aid policy, softening the Trudeau-era framework that made gender a central focus of Canadian foreign aid. While gender considerations will remain an aspect of diplomacy, the shift comes after years of criticism over ideologically driven or impractical aid programs. However, the change does not undo hundreds of millions already committed. In 2025 alone, Global Affairs Canada approved 177 multi-year projects referencing gender and locked into contracts through 2033 at a total cost of $1.73 billion. Examples include gender just rice. What? You're probably wondering what that is. A 4-year Oxfam Canadian-driven program integrating gender equity into rice production for 20,000 farmers in Vietnam. Okay. Gender-responsive public planning. A $4.5 million program in Bangladesh where St. Francis Xavier University is creating intersectional democratic spaces, training 950 minority women and promoting feminist leadership. Gender-responsive, climate-smart agriculture. What even is that? That's just a combination of words that don't make any sense. This is a 4-year program supporting women farmers, emphasizing gender-responsive, climate-smart practices over yields in Ghana. Okay. Empowering women peace builders. This is in the DR Congo, South Sudan, Colombia, West Bank, where they will be training activists at the intersection of climate, conflict, and gender inequality to the tune of $5 million. Promoting positive masculinities. We're going to talk about this a little more later, actually. This is a $9.5 million program in Morocco towards a microfinance program promoting awareness of barriers for women in positive masculinities alongside climate adaptation. And gender perspectives in arms control, a mere $480,000 program at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, where they examine how disarmament policy can benefit women. Despite Carney's rhetorical shift, these legally funded projects remain active, with Canadian taxpayers footing the bill for gender-framed aid for years to come. First of all, who in the hell signed up for any of these things? This country is struggling in a lot of ways. We have a cost of living crisis, a housing crisis. People can't put food on the table. We have high unemployment. We have a lot of problems here. We have a government that's overspending dramatically in almost every arena and inefficiently rather. And a lot of it, I would argue, is relatively corrupt. And this is where we're spending our money. For me, this is insane. I also think that it's insane to implement ideology in other places around the world, because effectively that's what this is, right? You're telling all these other countries that you're not doing it right, that you need to prioritize the things that we believe. Well, not what we believe, what our government believes. And the only way you get our money is if you drop it into these programs. So do you really think a lot of this money is even going to these things? If you're giving money directly to governments, the answer is 0% chance. And when you're giving it to these other programs like St. Francis Xavier's, when you're giving it to these schools, what are these people even doing? You're trying to implement these programs around the world, and I'd be willing to bet that their efficiency or effectiveness is a low single-digit percentage. This is preposterous. Telling the rest of the world how to live is such an insane position to take with our tax dollars. Now, the other thing that people would argue, and I think it's a reasonable argument depending on what country you are, is that this builds capacity. And so what that means is kind of like the USAID program. What it is you're sort of building favor with other nations. By supporting their programs and by putting money into their country, you will get favorable access to something else they offer, maybe natural resources, maybe support in UN votes. Again, it really depends on what country you are. Now, if I'm thinking about this from the United States perspective, I can sort of understand. I don't agree with how they're spending their tax dollars either, but I can sort of understand the perspective of building capacity because of because the volume of resources they extrapolate from so many places around the world and how influential they are on the global stage. So I sort of understand it a little bit. But for Canada, we're not a major player at anything. So building capacity with smaller nations literally makes no sense. You should be building capacity with your bigger brother allies like the United States, not virtue signaling with these other smaller countries and trying to implement your ideology. All right. Next story. The provincial and federal governments face class action lawsuits over the Kawichan land ruling and the threat to private property rights. A new proposed class action lawsuit in BC accuses both the provincial and federal governments of failing to warn property owners about the risks posed by unresolved Indigenous land claims. Risks brought into focus after a recent court ruling granted the Kawichan tribes Aboriginal title over 750 acres in Richmond, BC, including dozens of privately owned properties. The suit claims government's long new Aboriginal title could undermine the security of property ownership, but failed to defend property owners' rights or disclose the potential impact. Plaintiffs argue the ruling has caused economic loss, psychological harm, and widespread uncertainty, with one plaintiff saying all properties in British Columbia are now subject to claims of pre-existing Aboriginal title. The action seeks compensation for lost property value, emotional suffering, and even reimbursement of taxes and fees collected under what it calls misrepresented conditions. The Kawichan ruling, currently under appeal, has raised major questions about whether Aboriginal title and fee simple ownership can truly coexist. Another thing that's wildly insane in this country. I mean, this whole situation is completely out of whack. Here's my first problem with the whole thing. You're giving title back to Indigenous under the premise that they were here first, right? That's kind of the idea. We were here first. Okay, but who was here before them? Right? So the Kawichan are taking this land because they were the last Indigenous tribe to have it? Because what you're seeing now is other Indigenous tribes are going, well, no, we had that property first. So this isn't something that gets resolved, and this isn't something that Indigenous tribes are just going to go, yeah, cool, that's theirs, and we'll just miss out on the $100 billion worth of value. That's not going to happen. This is going to be such an absolute disaster. And the reason I know that is now you're seeing it in multiple cities in BC where they're trying to take over entire cities right now. You're seeing it in Ontario over massive swaths of land, the East Coast, massive, massive portions of land in Montreal as well. So this is not slowing down anytime soon. And the results, in my opinion, could be land seizure or at least a new Indigenous tax. So you could be looking at, maybe losing property, maybe, or at least a new property tax. And here's the thing. It's already super expensive to live in this country. So you add another property tax and then what happens? How untenable does this place become? And it really makes you ask, who would possibly invest here? So you start looking at the pipeline, you start looking at the major projects office again, you look at all these things and you kind of go to yourself, well, if I'm an investor or I'm a foreign investor or even a domestic investor, it doesn't really matter. If I'm looking at these things and going, at any time, my property could be taken or I could end up having to pay an additional tax to these Indigenous tribes, why would I possibly invest here? And the answer is you probably wouldn't. It's pretty risky. Which is really going to be challenging for Carney and how he generates all these investments. I just don't think this can go on. Now, if it does go on, here's how I think it could play out. My take is back to what I said originally. You've got a lot of tribes that will be fighting over who was here first, right? Okay. So if I'm the government, what do? Well, I say, well, guys, this is getting really confusing between all these Indigenous tribes. Why don't we just work through all these different lawsuits and decide how much of Canada is yours? And once that's resolved, let's just pick an arbitrary number like 50% for fun. So 50% goes to Indigenous claim. All right. Or under Aboriginal title, however you want to look at it. But there's infighting between all these different tribes. So what actually happens here is the government jumps in and goes, "We will manage the land for you. We will implement a new tax on Canadians. We will disperse it to all people who are Indigenous, and we will manage the land." And now effectively you have more government control and more taxes. That's how I think this could play out. All right, moving on. More than 23,000 patients in Canada died last year while on healthcare waiting lists. According to the Second Street organization, more than 23,000 Canadians died while waiting for healthcare this past year. The group found 23,746 deaths in the 2024-2025 fiscal year among people stuck on waiting lists for surgeries or diagnostic tests. This is a 3% increase from last year, and it doesn't even include Alberta or parts of Manitoba due to incomplete data. In total, over 100,000 Canadians have died on wait lists since 2018, while nearly 6 million are currently waiting for care. This happened despite record healthcare spending topping in at nearly $400 billion. The report highlights tragic cases, including patients waiting years for heart operations, hip replacements, or scans, and argues that governments track restaurant violations more carefully than waitlist deaths. It recommends better reporting, activity-based hospital funding, partnerships with private clinics, allowing more private options alongside the public system, and reimbursing Canadians who traveled abroad for faster care. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I'm very sick of how the boomer generation is telling us how great Canada's free healthcare is and why it's the best system in the world. So, A, it's not free. Okay. According to the Canadian Institute for Health Information, the total healthcare spending in Canada reached $372 billion in 2024, which works out to about $9,000 per Canadian. So it's not free. In fact, it costs more than it does in America. So it's not even remotely free. And B, it's among the worst in developed countries in the world. And that may be challenging to hear, but that's the reality we're in. We were last in primary care among the top 10 nations. We were among the worst on wait times, specialist access, and speed of elective surgeries. And we ranked 19th out of 20 in a recent global healthcare index, despite having the fourth highest healthcare spending relative to GDP. So the reality is we need a public-private healthcare model. We need a hybrid model like Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, and Australia, all countries who consistently rank near the top. In fact, Switzerland's been at the top for like the last decade. Now, let me explain how I see this model working out, because I think a lot of people hear this and they get irked. They go, no, we need to keep our free healthcare, Jonathan. Well, again, it's not free. How it works is you prioritize the public healthcare system. You pay your doctors better. You incentivize things a little better so that the pharma companies aren't the ones doing it. And then you create a private care system. And yes, people that have more money will have access to private care than over people who don't. That's just reality we live in. Some people drive Ferraris. It is what it is, okay? But the way the system works is there's like a set amount of time public healthcare should take. Anything over that amount of time, it overflows into the private system, and it is still covered by tax dollars. So now you stop waiting. And people go, well, how do we balance this out? It's called supply and demand, people. We know exactly how this is going to work. The private system will scale up accordingly to fill the public void and to fill the private void. And if it's done effectively, everyone will get rapid healthcare, and people that have money will get quicker healthcare. It is what it is. But the thing is, if there's more money in the system, our doctors will make more money and we will attract better talent. But also things will move faster for people that don't have the means that wealthier individuals do. And the other thing is it will actually cost, think about it this way, if done effectively, it should cost Canadian taxpayers less to do this because of the number of people that will pay for private healthcare. So these deaths, honestly, were senseless and unnecessary. This model should have been implemented for a very long time. And I think Canada needs to stop with this antiquated narrative that our free healthcare system is what makes this country so great, because honestly, it's become a dumpster fire. All right, moving on to our last story of the day. Canada's NGO class thinks it should choose your son's role models. This is wild. The Canadian government is now openly considering controlling the voices that young men hear online, replacing certain influencers like me with state approved role models. At a recent standing committee on Canadian heritage, Humberto Carollo of White Ribbon argued that young men searching for guidance online often encounter deeply misogynistic and hateful content. His solution is as chilling as it is casual. And I quote, "We need to change that. We need to quiet those hateful voices, misogynistic voices, and instead present good role model voices, influencers who care and share supportive allied narratives that young men can take on." I have many issues with this. First, their system created the problem. Young men do not want to be toxic, and they're not necessarily attracted to these toxic influencers because they want to be hateful. They follow them because society's offered no meaningful guidance or role models. Over the last 5 to 10 years, all young men have been told that everything is toxic masculinity and that they are the problem. So no real alternatives have been provided. That's why they turn to a lot of these people. Now, second, society is telling men to disappear. Media, schools, and woke authorities have spent years telling men to sit down and shut up. They've spent years telling us that there's no difference between men and women. And the only way that you can make men and women the same is if you take away masculinity. But this is woven into our DNA. And it's not toxic. Yes, toxic masculinity is a real thing. That's a very small sliver of men in the world that behave that way. And if I'm being quite honest with you, it's beta males trying to be alpha males. It's such a weird thing. It's not a real problem if you provide valuable role models, and you don't do that by implementing censorship. That moves on to my third point. Censorship is a coward's solution. Attempting to silence voices like Andrew Tate or Nick Fuentes won't fix anything. It's a cheap authoritarian attempt to paper over the failure of these institutions. Again, these guys rose to fame because there is no other solution, or society's being told at scale to quiet down and not do these things, which made room for these guys. That's really what's going on here. Number 4, institutional allyship masks weakness. Those that are calling for censorship often lack the qualities they preach. They don't have the courage, strength, or independence required to fit into the role of the male characters they're trying to take down. They are the men that are often unable to lead or to seize power. So what they do is they try to do it through regulation and bureaucracy. They basically want the world to be weak because they are weak. That's what this is. And look, I'm not saying that there is a one size fits all for men. In fact, I know that there's a sliding scale. Some people are ultra masculine, some people are not, and it's okay. Fall wherever you want to fall on that scale. Whatever's comfortable is exactly who you should be. But if you fall lower on that scale, you shouldn't stop other people from being higher on that scale because that's their natural state. So trying to censor that and quiet this down is the wrong solution. And it's not how society works. You need people in all of these different roles for society to excel anyway. Number 5, this whole manosphere thing, look, this is a symptom. It's not the disease. It's controversial influencers exist because young men are starving for guidance that the mainstream society refuses to provide. So you're blaming the messengers while ignoring to fill the void, and it's really absurd. 6, young men want strength, respect, and autonomy. They are biologically and socially wired to seek role models who embody courage, competence, and responsibility. Denying that reality, it really only fuels these alternative leaders. So rather than trying to censor, why don't we focus on those things? Why don't we give young men the opportunity to follow men that do exemplify strength, respect, autonomy, who have courage, who have competence, who show responsibility? Why don't we teach them those things? Because those aren't all necessarily ultra masculine features anyway. Everyone should take responsibility for their life. So these are things that apply across the entire spectrum of humanity. Trying to quiet these things down is 100% the wrong solution. And 7, ideological censorship only erodes trust. Trying to engineer thought and behavior through state-approved narratives will alienate young men further, deepening the resentment and creating more fertile ground for the very voices critics want to silence. If you continue to try to suppress these things, you're only going to make it worse, right? If you think about it like this, if you're going to have success in politics, you have to have compromise. How do you have compromise? You have compromise through conversation. Everybody in the same room or on the same platform arguing or battling or debating with their ideas, and the best ideas come to fruition or they win. They rise to the top, right? So it's the same with this. If you don't provide an open space and strong role models for these men to follow in an area where everybody exists, in the public square, so to speak, they're going to go into darker corners of society and these other silos, and they will become more extreme. So this will only make the problem worse. It's like the gun buyback program. Take guns away from everybody, and I bet crime goes up because the criminals will keep their weapons. This only makes things worse. So the solution is really to be a better role model, to win with better ideas and show the next generation the way and allow them to thrive using their own strengths, not some odd manufactured way of trying to be a weak man. I'm sorry, it just doesn't make any sense, right? And again, I'm not trying to bag on anybody for who they are or them wanting to be honest and authentic. But I think that's what these people are taking away from more masculine men. So I really hope that we see this turn around. And I really hope that reasonable voices win this conversation, because I think it's important for society. I think it's important for Canada, and I think it's important for our future. Well, that's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.